Welcome to the Make Meaning podcast. I'm Lynn Golodner, a writer, entrepreneur, and changemaker, and I've dedicated my life to sharing stories of how people make meaning in their work and find purpose in their lives. This podcast highlights some of the great ideas and activities people do every day to make the world a better place. So much of the meaning we find comes from interacting with great people, developing relationships that are mutually beneficial, and doing work that inspires. I hope you'll be inspired by the people you meet on this podcast. We all need to find a way to make meaning in the mundane. Welcome back to the Make Meaning podcast. I'm Lynn Golodner, and today I'm speaking with Molly Worthen, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also a freelance journalist. Molly's research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. Her most recent book, Apostles of Reason, examines American evangelical intellectual life since 1945. A contributing writer to the New York Times, Molly wrote a recent article entitled "The Anti-College is on the Rise" about the failings of American higher education and rising alternatives to it. Molly, welcome to the Make Meaning podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled to speak with you. As we talked about before the interview, I came across your article and then wanted to learn more about you and your work because as the parent of 4 teenagers, the state of college today is definitely on my mind. So that was a fascinating article, but then I was really pleased to learn more about the breadth of your work. So I'd like to begin by learning a little bit about how you chose your focus. What led you to study North American religious and intellectual history?
I suppose as I progressed through university myself, I became really interested in how human beings across time and place make meaning, to use the language of your podcast.
I love it.
I grew up in a secular context. I did not grow up in a religious home, and yet as I took more and more courses in history across, around the globe, it dawned on me that for most human beings, religion has been a huge part of how they understand the world, and I wanted to learn more about it. At the same time, I became increasingly aware that religion was this major part of our public conversation about politics and culture wars and Americans' struggles to really work productively to build a flourishing society. And I got interested in journalism as a way of learning more about the world myself and having an occasion to talk to interesting people and get them to make time for me. But I just felt I didn't quite know enough to contribute a whole lot to that public conversation, and I needed more time in school, more time to read the big books, the scriptural authorities and these different traditions and learn about their history. And so I actually went to graduate school after some detours to be a religion writer, not really to be an academic.
Okay.
But I suppose I realized that I have too risk-averse a temperament to be a full-time journalist, especially as, in the course of my time in graduate school, the bottom really fell out of the economy of the media, newspapers and magazines, and it just wasn't as easy as it once was.
Yeah.
And I became, I think, a little bit spoiled by the wonderful things about being, having a perch at a big university and doing journalism from that home. And so that's what I do now. I mainly teach courses in North American religious and intellectual history. I dabble in global Christianity also. And I write these periodic essays about religion and public life, about higher education. And I try always to bring some history and theology kind of into the story of current events.
I love it. And you have the best of both worlds. You've achieved your goal but in a more comfortable route, which is really cool.
I hope so.
It's funny that you say this. Just this morning I was doing some writing about religion, and I come from a secular Jewish background, spent some time in a more religious community, about a decade. And I say I'm sort of like a hodgepodge of Jewish denominations at this point, because I really appreciate the ritual and the framework and the answers that religion can give you, but I bristle at the expectation that you do things a certain way, or that somebody else says, do this now or don't do this, or, So so I look at other religions with envy in a way, like, oh, it would be so easy just to go to church every week, or it would be so easy to just, there aren't these dietary laws or whatever. So I wonder what it is about religion that either attracts us or repels us. Have you come up with any, simple answers to that? I think it's ever present for sure.
I think that conundrum is what fascinates me so much. I certainly have not come up with any kind of grand unifying theory to explain why some humans end up in or stay in, the rigorous religious community they have been raised in or find it on their own, and why others really run in the other direction, and others are somewhere in between.
Uh-huh.
I do believe that as humans we are wired to ask these questions that science and other materialist earthly tools just can't answer.
Right.
We're wired to wonder about the void, and there are evolutionary psychologists who will give you all kinds of reasons premised on our needs and wants as cavemen to explain that. And I find those explanations interesting, but I suppose not totally satisfying.
Right.
And I think part of my own interest in religion is driven by a really sincere envy, frankly, of people who have found their spiritual home and have a set of answers to these disturbing questions that keep us all up at night if we let them creep into our brains.
Absolutely.
And I am, I guess I hope that one day I sort of find a set of answers that satisfy me as well. And in the meantime, I'm just really interested in learning more about other people's worldviews and trying to guide my students into a critical but deeply empathetic view and posture toward people who are coming out of worldviews very different from their own.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by the universality of religions. And I've been fortunate enough in my work as a journalist and a marketing consultant to travel the world with clients and on my own and see different traditions. I've been at the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and I knew nothing about Sikhism until then.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And I've obviously been in India, and I've learned about Hinduism, and I've been to Israel, and I wrote a book a number of years ago about bread and how it impacts different communities. And that's one of the universal things that we all have. And so there's so much that is similar, and even the structure of ritual or of the day or of the year, there are so many similarities that it always saddens me when we're divided by religion, when we have so much in common that we do similarly.
I think that's right. I think certainly we're asking the same questions, and this is something that I say to my students at the outset of my course that's kind of an introduction to a religion in the U.S. and Canada, and a survey of essentially many of the world's religions, but in the context of North America. And I say, as different as these faiths are, in their doctrines and their practices, they are all asking the same questions. They're all asking, where did we come from? Where are we going?
Yeah.
What do we have to do to get right with the divine?
Right.
How do we explain the unexplainable? At the same time, I am skeptical of those perhaps overzealous ecumenical activists who would like to collapse the significant chasms between world religions and say, oh, well, they all boil down to the golden rule, and so why can't we all get along?
Sure.
That's just silly.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually, Islam and Judaism and Christianity, for example, they have lots in common, but they also differ in substantial ways in how they understand human beings, how they think about, the relationship between the church and the secular government. And of course, the divisions within those communities are often so profound and complicate the picture too. Yeah. So I think to understand religion, we have to somehow walk that line of seeing the commonalities while respecting the differences.
Absolutely. Very well said. Well, I want to pivot a little bit because you are quite an accomplished writer, and I'm pretty impressed with your list of publications. And I especially enjoyed, as I said earlier, your recent New York Times article about, quote unquote, the anti-college. How did that topic come under your radar?
I am employed by a fairly mainstream, big research university, which really, I think, does its best to serve all different kinds of communities in the state and the country, with also an orientation toward global issues as well. But it's a big, old, complicated institution that, in which change of any real significance is, I think, hard to enact in a quick experimental way. And there is so much that's frustrating about higher education. And so I was interested, as I started to read more about reform efforts in the landscape of American higher education, I was interested in some of these really brave reformer, experimenter, activists, whatever you want to call them, who were kind of striking out on their own. And trying to tackle some of the challenges and problems, the astronomical cost of higher education, the failure of so many students to really find ways to ask and answer deep questions about vocation and life's purpose in the context of courses that are often so oriented toward, a salary at the end of your degree. And all the disagreement about the right ways to address these questions. I was interested in exploring these efforts to make progress on these challenges in higher education, maybe outside of the world of mainstream higher ed in which I'm embedded.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to the University of Michigan and I graduated in 1993. And it was at a time where, luckily, my parents paid for my education. It was not nearly as expensive in comparable dollars as it is today. And it was an opportunity, I think, looking back on it, to, yes, become equipped to walk into a career, but really to grow up a little bit intellectually and to have the gift of taking classes and exploring ideas and thought and text. And I think, I sort of came away from that with this assumption that a college education is an opportunity to develop who you are as a young adult. And so you can better choose how you're going to contribute to the world and step out there. But at the cost that we're seeing today, I'm wondering if that's still true. And you said in your article that professors like you have the job of, and I'm quoting here, leading students in a survey of how civilization's greatest minds wrestled with philosophical problems, which is how I definitely saw my college experience and the role of higher education. So I'm wondering if you think that's no longer the role, or if it's just become a luxury because of the cost associated with it. What do you see as today the role of higher education?
I think the failure of universities to really foreground the essential questions about life's purpose and helping students, think in a big, deep way about their place in the big picture, that problem is connected to, but quite distinct from, the problem of the rising cost. The rising cost, I think, to disentangle that is not an easy thing. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that, and in the context of public higher education, the sphere that I'm in, it has something to do with the trend since the 1980s in state governments really across the country to defund public education and really encourage universities like the University of Michigan, for example, to basically become private institutions. To gain a greater and greater amount of their funding and support, more and more of their budget through private fundraising, by raising tuition on primarily out-of-state and often international students. There are some exceptions to that. My university, UNC, is actually, because of the way the North Carolina state laws are written, it can't make that move. That has been very common in the University of California system and some of the other elite public systems. But we pay a real cost for that. We're really, I think, struggling in a way that schools like University of Michigan and University of Virginia that have had more leeway to privatize are not. So we're still relatively affordable, but it's not really a sustainable model. And I think a lot of what people read about the ballooning administrative infrastructure and the the arms race to offer students nicer and nicer amenities. I mean, there's a lot to that.
Sure.
And it's to the detriment of investment in classrooms and in faculty who are, tenured and given permanent positions to really dig in and invest in the institution and the students. That's not where the money's going, by and large. The money's going elsewhere. I think a related trend, which is quite intimately connected to the problem you mentioned, and the problem that preoccupied me in that article, this abandonment of kind of the philosophical inquiry part of higher education, is the vocationalization, I'll say, of mainstream universities. So, probably, in the early 90s when you were in school, at a place like Michigan, there were certainly some majors and departments that were very much oriented toward practical skills, journalism or engineering. But those kinds of programs have totally mushroomed in the years since then. And they siphon students away from courses in philosophy or literature or history. And this, I guess, brings us circling back to the money question, because why is it that students feel such pressure to take those quote unquote practical classes and, leave aside the classes that may foster the big question asking?
Right.
It's because they've gone into such debt.
Right.
To get this education, of course, they feel this pressure. Their parents are probably pressuring them to make sure you have some real skills. I think they're often misled about which classes lead to earning potential. Certainly the data that's been collected on the fate of, say, English majors or history majors or philosophy majors really contradicts this idea that a traditional liberal arts education doesn't equip you to do anything, because it turns out, and I hear this all the time from friends of mine in other professions, in the business world, in law firms, or during the hiring. It turns out that the most valuable skills are not, have you mastered this most recent version of a trendy software, but rather, can you write?
Yes.
Can you think in a straight line?
Yes.
Can you pull ideas together? Can you find evidence and make sense of it and communicate it to other people?
Right.
Where do you learn those things? You learn them in, the humanities classes primarily. I do think, too, that the humanities courses have sort of suffered a crisis of confidence, though, and they've contributed to this abandonment of the big questions and the big books.
Well, and if we're not asking the big questions, we don't develop depth and we don't develop perspective, which helps us with innovation, which helps us with advancement, and all kinds of things. It saddens me a bit, because I do think that by not having that opportunity to just wander and explore and ask and debate, we're really missing out on something very deep in our intellectual landscape. At the same time, I'm having conversations with my kids. I have 4 teenagers at home about how I keep saying it doesn't matter where you go to college, it's what you do with it. And I hope I'm not misleading them, but I also don't want them coming out of undergrad with a 6-figure debt on their shoulders. And
of course,
when I grew up, you went to the best university you could get into, and it was a mark of pride. And today it's more of a dollars and cents question for a lot of kids. It's, really, who's going to give me the most in scholarships? Where will I have the least debt from? And it's a pragmatic conversation. So the dreaminess, I think, of that time of life is dissipating a little bit, unfortunately.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the advice you give your kids is bang on, in that at the vast majority of mainstream colleges and universities, if you know where to look, you can find the great classes and the wonderful mentors who will give you, a first-rate education and guide you through those big questions and suggest books for you to read and really work with you on your writing. But the vast majority of 18-year-olds are just not equipped to do that on their own.
Right.
They don't know who to ask for advice. They don't even know what they're looking for. So it's an unreasonable expectation, and I think that that's part of what motivated some of the reformers that I spoke to for my article, is a sense that young people need a little more guidance. And these were all kind of programs or short degrees. None were 4-year complete bachelor's programs, at
Mm-hmm.
least not yet,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of offered students a boot camp
Yeah.
in life philosophy, and I think are marketing themselves as an addition, an addendum, a supplement to a more conventional bachelor's degree.
It's interesting because I do think, we talk on the show about meaning and purpose, and I know a lot of people in midlife who are questioning that. How am I doing something meaningful? How am I contributing to the greater good? What's my purpose? Because at midlife we can have those existential conversations. But I do think that there is that dreaminess that I mentioned earlier is so important, that comes earlier in life when you the sky is the limit and you believe you can do anything, so you try, and you can. I think that's really important. And I just think that time and space and experience give us that. And without that, where do we end up?
Right. It's kind of a version of the old cliche that youth is wasted on the young.
Yes.
That now if you could only go back and do your education over again, you know exactly what classes you'd take and you wouldn't waste any time. At parties you would, dig into your papers. But of course we can't go back and live that way. So the question is, how do we create an educational experience that, is not naive about the life position of the average college student, and in fact makes the most of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as we are near the end of our conversation, I do want to ask you to give a little bit of your advice to our listeners about this question of contribution and meaning. I love the story of your journey, because you just sort of stumbled into a profession based on your curiosity and your yearning. So what would you tell our listeners about how they find their purpose or their path?
I think a lot of young people today feel pressure to find their passion. That's a cliche we hear a lot about. Just, figure out what you're passionate about and get good at it, and the rewards will come.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's a lovely slogan, but, it can be very daunting for the average young person. I mean, I still am not really sure what my passion is. I know I've got a few things I do that I really enjoy that, at least on my good days, I think are, reasonably valuable contributions to civilization. But am I confident that they are the only way I could have lived a fulfilling life? Absolutely not. Do I have doubts about them once in a while? Of course.
Yeah.
So I think that it's more important to just identify some questions you have, some things you're curious about, some people you'd like to spend time with, and pursue that. And the passion follows. I was struck by some of the patterns I detected among these educational reform efforts. Many of them were really devoted to plugging students into a local community. One called Outer Coast is based in Sitka, Alaska, and has a special mission to serve underserved Indigenous Alaskans, as well as bringing some people into the state to really get to know it. And students are really compelled to develop relationships with the community and find ways to serve the community and learn about Indigenous poetry alongside kind of more traditional Western canon readings.
Interesting.
Another program, the RIT Project, plants students both. There's two programs, one in Alaska and one in the Western Mountains of North Carolina, and it's a similar kind of impulse to dig into your local place. Another called the Wayfinding Academy is based in Portland, and encourages students to, complement their studies by getting out into the Portland community and working through internships and kind of project-based learning where they are. And I'm really struck by the way, even in this kind of postmodern, globalized world in which we are urging students to, ignore boundaries and study abroad and travel widely and be cosmopolitan global citizens, there's still this abiding human hunger to be just rooted in a place and understand the kinds of questions and relationships that are possible if you just stay put for a little while and commit to a place. And, that's one way of looking at this question of meaning making, at least in kind of a short-term way, that says, maybe if you just accept where you are and open your eyes to what you have to gain from this place, you can cover a lot of ground.
That's a beautiful way to look at things, is to really see the beauty where you are as opposed to looking for something else. That sense of rootedness and context and community. I'm hearing you talk about community too. The human connection is so much about how we cultivate wisdom and find that meaning and purpose in life and in work. It's really, really beautiful. Well, Molly Worthen, thank you so much for being on the Make Meaning podcast. I'm so impressed by your work, and I look forward to reading more.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Make Meaning podcast with Lynn Golodner. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I'd love it if you would share our great conversations with your people so we can all add meaning wherever we go and whatever we do.